Have you ever played a game that was both the victim of the time it was released in, while also being ahead of it? Something caught up in the tropes of the era to the game's overall detriment, while also implementing mechanics that would go on to become generation-defining tropes down the line? That sums up my experience with the oddly titled Wolfenstein, developed by Raven Software and published by Activision in 2009, which for the rest of the review will be called Wolfenstein 2009. This is a title that harbors some of the defining traits and flaws of the post-Call of Duty 4 era of first-person shooters, and at the same time meshes those with other features that would serve as common design decisions years afterwards. The result of this walking contradiction is a game which feels unfocused, promising, yet is altogether an enjoyable but frustrating experience. Hell, judging by how the game's been pulled from most avenues of digital sales, it seems like Bethesda and ZeniMax just want this game deleted from existence. It was even hard to get a used copy for review. When I went to the store, the clerk behind the desk kept asking me why I wanted this inferior product when I could easily just buy Skyrim or Fallout 4. Guy kept persisting too. He was pretty hostile throughout the entire interaction, and as I left with my copy of Wolfenstein 2009, he muttered something about wanting to see my receipt for Elder Scrolls Online, or something like that. Dude's name was Rod, I think. I should really report his ass. Getting to the point, this means that I had to play the game on console for this review, and the gameplay footage will be from a channel called GamePlayShare. This was a massive help for the review, so go check his channel out. Raven Software was an independent game studio founded in 1990 by Brian and Steve Raffel. As it so happens, Raven Software was originally located just down the street from their eventual partner of about 15 years, id Software. The Raffel brothers had put out an ad asking for a PC programmer, an ad witnessed by none other than id's John Romero. After this, id made arrangements to meet up with the Raffels, the latter showing off some apparently impressive artwork, and the former giving the pair an early look at the then in development Wolfenstein 3D. The Raffels were blown away, and the two studios began working very closely after this, with tech from id being licensed out to Raven, John Carmack helping out with programming tips, and Romero acting as creative consultant. Raven's first big release was 1994's Heretic, a first-person shooter based on the Doom engine, notable for its dedicated fantasy RPG aesthetic in a similar vein to something like Ultima Underworld, and having the ability for the player to look both up and down. Sounds quaint now, but think of how mind-blowing that is coming off of the other id games like Wolfenstein 3D or Doom. Afterwards, Raven released Hexen, Beyond Heretic, expansions for both it and Heretic, Take No Prisoners, and Mage Slayers, before the pressures of running an independent game studio got to the Raffels, and they became a subsidiary of Activision in 1997. Raven would continue to develop games after this acquisition, putting out Hexen and Heretic 2, the Soldiers of Fortune games, and a couple of the Star Wars Jedi Knight games, to name a few. Most notable for our purposes would be Quake 4. Their partners for Studio id having become a part of Activision in 1997, when the publisher purchased a 49% stake into the studio. It was this contribution to the id Software lineage that had id ask Raven to take the reins of a new Wolfenstein title, which the latter happily agreed to do. It was originally planned to be a much more ambitious project for the time, being a fully open world game that the player could progress through as they pleased. But after a couple years of the project going nowhere, Raven took it in a new direction and released the Wolfenstein we know today. From the moment the player takes control of BJ Blazkowicz, they'll immediately get a feel for how modern Wolfenstein 2009 was for its time. The player walks slowly and has a limited sprint which is barely any faster but shakes the screen like mad. In hindsight, I now regret my complaint of how the sprint was handled in Return to Castle Wolfenstein. At least in that game, the sprint felt like an actual run, you could shoot while sprinting, the screen didn't headbang, and you could see your stamina bar. On top of this, you aim primarily with the industry standard ADS, aim down the sight for the uninitiated, and due to the implementation of a health regen, you'll spend a good chunk of the fights with the Nazis in a stop and pop, cover shooter manner. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, of course. While you may fight Nazi grunts while doing the cover shooter shuffle, the mutant and sexy elite guard enemies haul ass towards the player in an attempt to bludgeon them to death. The spellcasters teleport and focus more on buffing the regular Nazis. The jetpack soldiers kill you by sheer force of annoyance alone, and both the super soldiers and pyro guys lumber towards the player while unloading everything they have on them. Despite my faults with the implementation of health regen and combat, Wolfenstein 2009 has good enemy variety. However, the lion's share of enemies are the basic soldier types who love to fight you in the cover manner described prior. In all fairness, when the game does start mixing more of the enemies together later on in the campaign, the fights do become very enjoyable. What was also genre standard for the time, and present in Wolfenstein 2009, is the somewhat dull level design. The main mission levels that the player finds themselves walking through are a collection of hallways which lead into fairly large arenas for the player to engage enemies in. There are little, if any, real attempts made by Raven to place forks in the road, alternate paths, sections requiring backtracking besides just doing said lines in reverse during an escape sequence, or something of that nature. The arenas are also flat expanses filled to the brim with chest-high cover. Now, keep this in mind, generally linear level design which lead into combat arenas for first-person shooters is not inherently a bad thing, as there are a few games which make this work. From the Serious Sam games, to Painkiller, and the somewhat recently released, and also oddly titled, Doom 2016. It's this final example which I believe acts as a decent comparison to Wolfenstein 2009, in terms of how the level design was handled in each. The levels in Doom 2016 are hallways leading into arenas, like those of Wolfenstein 2009. Getting tired of this reboot title yet? But the key differences lie in one word: verticality. Spaces between the combat segments have optional paths for the player to walk along to find secrets, hidden switches which activate classic Doom 1 and 2 maps, and in some levels even allow the player to tackle challenges in an order of their own choosing. The arenas take full advantage of their 3D space by layering them with platforms, cutaways, paths leading between the layers, and other things for both player and enemy alike to hop around on. Rather than being a flat plain with cover, explosive barrels, and some buildings thrown in to liven it up, the average Doom 2016 arena encourages players to go up, down, and all around, taking full advantage of the space provided. Now, Doom 2016 is a flawed game. Don't take this as a shiny endorsement of excellence. And I'm not suggesting that Wolfenstein 2009 needed to be an arena shooter in the same vein. I just wanted to point out how the level design doesn't often take advantage of what's at the player's disposal. Now, it's worth noting that I'm only talking about the level design in terms of the main missions. I'll be touching on the hub in a bit, but I'll say for now that it fares quite a bit better. Moving back to the combat, I'd like to address the weapons featured in the game. Rather than follow suit with what its contemporaries did at the time, Wolfenstein 2009 doesn't limit the player to only a couple weapons, and gives them the full arsenal to be used at once. To my recollection, this is one of the first console-focused shooters that implemented the weapon wheel for this feature, something we see in use to this day. This results in a somewhat smaller arsenal compared to the prior game, however. 8 guns in comparison to the 12 from Return to Castle Wolfenstein. You have some expected guns, of course. The MP40 and MP43 serve as the game's 2 automatic weapons, and the Kar98 bolt action serves well for ranged fights. I'll throw in a pro tip for anyone thinking of playing the game. Max out upgrades on the car. It's very much worth the investment as soon as you can do it. There's also a rocket launcher, because of course you have a rocket launcher. However, the real stars of the show are the more unique weapons. The returning flamethrower from Return to Castle Wolfenstein feels better than ever, making quick work of nearly every enemy in a fittingly gruesome manner, complete with some nasty screams. The Tesla gun is also more enjoyable than its original incarnation, the multiple arcs resulting in an explosion which immediately kills the enemy or enemies on the receiving end. The particle cannon is pretty fun in its own right, acting as a strong laser with some decent reach and packing a hell of a punch. Finally, the Leichenfaust 44 is basically the BFG 9000. Maybe literally a precursor if the whole id timeline is actually a thing, which shoots a big green ball that obliterates enemies and renders their bodies limp with bullet time. The firearms at the player's disposal add a needed amount of spice to the combat of the game, and the latter missions are more enjoyable due to the ability to utilize them all. There is a downside to the more exotic weapons, however. While they may be incredibly fun to shoot under ideal circumstances, the design of the arenas don't often complement their utility. All of the weapons I listed prior, which are the most enjoyable to fight with, are also range limited, suited for close encounters rather than the more spacious firefights that take up most of Wolfenstein 2009. While the magic abilities negate some of the issues with the health system in place, the close range of the fun guns, mixed with how fast the player dies while under fire, and the size of the combat arenas, do not encourage players to use them all too often. For the solid majority of the game, the automatic weapons will be your go-to choices. Up to this point, I've only addressed the missions when talking about the game's level design, while ignoring one of the largest chunks of this topic. While I stand by what I said on that subject, I will say that the hub of Eisenstadt was something I did enjoy. A fictional German city under martial law, Eisenstadt has multiple interlinking paths through city streets, sewers, and to a lesser extent the rooftops that connect the players to paths between the main missions, the weapon upgrade shop, and both the story factions at the Kreisau Circle and the Golden Dawn. There are multiple houses and other locations off the beaten path which have gold and tomes for you to collect, as well as a handful of side quests to take up your time in between story missions. While the path marker at the top of your screen will always be there to point you towards your objective, it can actually be easier in certain cases to travel once you've spent the time needed to memorize the layout of the city, as well as finding the numerous secrets along the way. In other words, Eisenstadt rewards player investment in it. Enemies in Eisenstadt also change based on the progression through the missions, with them getting superior troops and equipment as the player in turn grows more powerful. Overall, Eisenstadt is an enjoyable hub that makes me wonder why more of these open world shooters, which have grown popular today, don't do something on a smaller scale like this. It was Warren Spector who once said that he wanted to make a city block RPG that details every nook and cranny of a single city block, and an obviously less intense design to concepts such as this might make for a more interesting experience to be used over the full-on sandboxes. Another mechanic I've mentioned frequently is the upgrade system, which is a mixed bag of merits. I'll start off with full disclosure, because I need to establish that I don't enjoy upgrade systems in action games like this. They make weapons feel gimped when you first use them, and upgrades can be difficult to balance between feeling as if they are mandatory or superfluous. There are exceptions to this rule, obviously, but my bias against them should be put out there. In context to Wolfenstein 2009, it's not much of an issue. All of the upgrades to the weapons and magic are mostly just there for convenience, which is fine. It's nothing to write home about, but it's better than how the upgrades were handled in Doom 2016, going back to that comparison. While in Doom the game became easier as you went along due to these upgrades, Wolfenstein 2009 is a bit better at scaling the difficulty so you can't just breeze through the ladder sections. And now, finally, we get to the magic system. The key gimmick of Wolfenstein 2009, the magic enabled by the Thule medallion adds some flavor to the combat, and is mandatory for traversing the environment in some ways. The general abilities in the medallion are how you can uncover secrets, go into bullet time, make a giant shield, and make your bullets stronger. Like the upgrade system, the magic system is a mixed bag, which is a phrase I've no doubt run into the ground. I'm ambivalent to the Veil ability, the one that lets you uncover secrets in the environment, but the other three are a bit more complicated. For the most part, the addition of the magic powers adds quite a bit to the combat of Wolfenstein 2009, by giving the player a wider variety of offensive and defensive abilities. You can mix them on the fly, and your ability to do so is tested pretty effectively towards the game's end. Now, on the other hand, the magic meter, the resource which your Keanu Reeves abilities draw from, completely breaks the pace of combat. Which, playing devil's advocate, did have to be there for balancing. With how powerful some of the abilities are, being able to use them nearly indefinitely would destroy all semblance of difficulty. The magic meter is pretty much a required resource for most of the game, so during the actual fights the player will deplete their meter, run back to one of the many magic recharge spots littered throughout the environment, sit around waiting for it to refill, and then run back to the fight. Rinse, and repeat. For larger encounters, one might have to do this process multiple times. Needless to say, it's very tedious. Still, I'm of the opinion that this game does more right than wrong in this regard. The fights that do test your abilities to manage the different enemy types, weapons, and the magic all at once are a great amount of fun, regardless if the pace is broken by the magic meter resupply runs. I should probably start addressing everything else around Wolfenstein 2009, outside of the directly gameplay related aspects, despite how I'm completely clueless on these topics. Even more clueless than I am on what makes a good game, but let's ignore that. The soundtrack is pretty solid. There isn't anything on it I would listen to on its own, but it serves the in-game activities well, and gives some Hellraiser and Danny Elfman Batman vibes to me. Could be off base though. The story is personally not up my alley, even when comparing it to the bare-bones narratives of most other id Software shooters. There are some heavy Indiana Jones vibes on display in Wolfenstein 2009. BJ even dresses like Ford's iconic character. However, replacing the Christian mythology aspects with Black Sun parallel worlds,
basically slipgates, and adding what I assume is supposed to be a version of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I should at least mention that Hans Gross does return in this game, but this is conflicting. On one hand, it is interesting to see a character return beyond just BJ, but on the other hand, you killed him in Wolfenstein 3D. He's not even a zombie, he's just there. It's a lesser example of how I'd feel if they brought back Hitler as the villain in a future Wolfenstein title. Yeah, it's a cool callback and all, but it takes some of the satisfaction out of killing him the first time. BJ Blazkowicz talks for the first time beyond his goofy little screams from Wolfenstein 3D, and for some reason I find him more generic here than in the games where he was a silent protagonist. The silly little facial expressions from 3D and the aforementioned "Yeah!" were more endearing, and even the completely speechless blowjob from Return to Castle Wolfenstein had that interesting in theory personality detail revealed in the game's ending. In 2009, BJ is just Hero Man, and has little in the way of unique characterization. He barely speaks, not once uttering a peep during gameplay if I recall correctly, and when he does talk, he displays practically nothing in the way of unique personality. Maybe this is just because I'm a sucker for the silent incarnations, and BJ is personally my favorite first-person shooter protagonist, so perhaps I'm just being overly critical of something almost entirely insignificant. The version of Death's Head we see in Wolfenstein 2009 is also pretty inconsistent with what little we knew of him from Return to Castle Wolfenstein. In the game prior, Death's Head was characterized in notes as someone who had no interest in the occult or the other esoteric fixations of his colleagues, preferring to focus entirely on his pseudoscience creations. He was someone who couldn't care less about the paranormal, yet here he is in Wolfenstein 2009, his goal to harness the powers of the Black Sun dimension, something overtly supernatural. For such a simple character, I'm surprised Raven Software couldn't keep it consistent. This game takes the occult half of the Wolfenstein world and lore to its absolute limit without trying to mix it in with the pseudoscience aspects very much at all. I realize I'm sounding like a broken record, but Return to Castle Wolfenstein handled all these aspects much better than its sequel. While the overall game is a mixed bag, Wolfenstein 2009 tends to be something that offers more positive things than negative. I did enjoy my time with it on the whole, and after hearing all the negative reactions from critics and fans over the years, I'd certainly feel comfortable calling this an overlooked gem. Having said that, I'm also regrettably left feeling like this is a console-fixated shooter with a load of underutilized potential, and would have been better off without some of the attempts to follow the pack of its time. In the end, while I am conflicted on Wolfenstein 2009, I would recommend this to both series fans and action game enthusiasts alike. In the next part, we'll take a look at Wolfenstein the New Order, the first game in the series made after ZeniMax and Bethesda acquired id Software and its properties.